Hello, everybody, and happy Juneteenth. We are going to maybe wait 30 more seconds or so and let folks come on. We're right at the top of the hour. Really appreciate you taking this hour today. And I know that there are many, many demands on your time. So super grateful. I'm Kathleen Trapp-Hagan, and I'm coordinating the Grantmakers for Education Out of School Time Impact Group. And when we started out with these web seminars, we were doing them every Friday, and then we started doing them bi-weekly. GFE had a few other things that it needed to do in the past couple of Fridays, so we are getting back on our track. We've got the July 4th holiday coming up, which I think will be a little bit of a bump, but then we'll get back on track with our bi-weeklies. And so I really appreciate you coming back into this community. We are really excited about the program that we're having today with our friends over at the Readiness Projects. And so before I take up too much time, I'm going to hand it over to Terri Ferinde from Collaborative Communications. And also, if you could introduce yourself using the chat, that would be great. Just let us know who you are and your organization. And Terri, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. It's such a pleasure to be here, and appreciate all of you who are projects. And you may have heard of it, but what's really important to take away from today is how it can help you. There's some really great thinkers and work here, and a lot of ways to access it. I'm Terri Ferinde. As Kathleen said, I'm with Collaborative Communications. I work with a lot of you individually, but it is my honor and pleasure to work with the Readiness Projects. And today I'm here to introduce and facilitate this conversation with these coordinating partners. So brief introductions, and then I'll put some bio notes in the chat box in just a few minutes. From the Forum for Youth Investment, we have Karen Pittman and Marita Irby. You guys can wave, and so everyone knows who you are. From the National Urban League, we've got Hal Smith, and from the American Institutes for Research, Deborah Moroney. And we've got many of their colleagues are also on the call, so if we need to pull them in, we can do that. So glad to have everyone here. In short, the Readiness Projects are working to look for and promote bold, science-informed, equitable supports for thriving youth. Our partners are going to share how they're doing it, how we can work with you. The OST and related funders, those of you who are on the call and your colleagues are and have been so critical in growing this field in immeasurable ways. We're grateful for your bold thinking, the systems building, the field support, the focus on quality, everything that you're doing, and we're eager to work with you as we move forward. So I'm going to just kick us off. We'll do a couple of segments, a little bit on what is the Readiness Projects and why this work is so important. Then we'll go into some of the current context and some of that work, and really get into what you can do to work with the Readiness Projects moving forward. At any point, please put your questions in the chat box, and we will get to those kind of throughout. We won't wait till the end for that. But let's start with Karen. Do you mind sharing a little bit about why this partnership came together and what we're trying to accomplish?
Sure. Thanks, Terri, and welcome to everyone. I see people I know coming into the chat, which is great. First, the folks that are at the Urban League and at American Institutes for Research are old friends and colleagues that we've worked with for decades. So this is not new in the sense that we enjoy working together. But the seeds of this partnership were really planted in the more intensive time that we started to spend together, first as our various roles related to the SEED Commission, the Social, Emotional, and Academic Development Commission, then our roles as with the SOLD Alliance, the Science of Learning and Development Alliance, with our more recent roles as that we're playing as advisors to the Equitable Learning and Development Project. And I could keep going with more acronyms, but you're getting the sense of what was happening. We were finding ourselves sitting at these very important tables with K-12 educators, researchers, leaders, policymakers, who were really grappling with how to take the science about how learning happens, bring it in to K-12, make sure it's really being used to push forward and upend inequities, and support all young people towards bolder goals of thriving. So this was happening in an increased number of tables, and we were sitting there as important advisors. And that was exciting for folks, frankly, coming out of the youth development space to be invited to sit at these critical tables. What we were finding, however, was that the messages that we were giving were pretty consistent, which was good, but that it was really taking a lot of work to get those messages to stick. That it wasn't enough to just sit at the table and give advice and then come back and see that they suddenly had been deeply implemented. We were getting the words into things, but we weren't really getting the full meaning and implications into things. And so we decided that it was time for us to really, in a sense, find some money to put more staff power behind our mouths, if I want to sort of flip that, that phrase. And so with support from the Bechtel Foundation and more recent support from the Wallace Foundation, we really sort of formalized the work that we were doing to both send but also offer to help deepen the use of a set of messages that started with, let's really make sure we're talking about all adults and all settings and all young people, starting with all the adults in the school building, not just the teachers, all settings, not just the classroom, all young people, even those who have already dropped out of school but need to be brought back in, and certainly adolescents, not just younger people. Let's make sure we're talking about the set of community organizations and experiences, not just a vague definition of community, but really where the horsepower is in communities to support learning and development in organized ways, and what those organizations and entities bring to the table and often bring into the school buildings. And then let's really make sure that we're focused on not just engaging young people and families and communities to sort of listen and advise, but also deeply in the process of assessment and critical analysis and planning and implementation. So we were saying those things, those messages over and over again, all in the spirit of saying, if we're going to write the word equity, we have to tackle all of those things to really bring meaning to the word equity. And we decided that in order to do this, with the number of partners that we already have and the numbers of tables where we were sitting, that we really should find a way to have dollars, and more important than the dollars, because we started this before the dollars were formalized, make a commitment to basically be of service. So the reason we call it the Readiness Projects, as opposed to calling it the name of some new name of some entity that we have created together, is that our focus is really on creating sort of mini projects that help advance these ideas through partnerships with organizations, with initiatives, with entities that already have good intent, but just need more horsepower to get there. So once people say they're willing to work with us, we want to come in and say, we're happy to help you really put your money where your mouth is, or put your meaning where your mouth is. This is an example on the screen of what we did to get this started with the Seed Commission. There was talk about involving those other partners that are community partners and nonprofit youth development partners and after-school partners and health partners. But what we did was to actually get funding to bring them together as their own work group, and then write an issue brief that said, this is what it means for you to partner with us. And so if you haven't seen that, that's an important piece to look at. So with that initial funding, we've really been able to stand up this partnership. Our first job was to really make sure we're all on the same page, because there are a lot of acronyms, there are a lot of initiatives. And again, it's easy to sort of come to the table and go, okay, we kind of understand what you're saying. Here's how we can be supportive. But for us to really say we're going to do maximum good in this space, we thought we had to really dig in and set some priorities, and then test out what it means to actually sort of have what we call sort of robust definitions together. So the priorities, and these reflect what I just said, is how do we really advance stickier narratives about how the science of learning and development can be used to advance equity and thriving. So we're not just assuming that it does, we're really demonstrating that it does. And we're taking the time not to just translate the science, but to really figure out what the critical issues are around equity and thriving, and talk about how the science applies to those issues. We really want to amplify the voices of youth and community leaders. We want to make sure that we're talking about this, all adults, all settings, and I'll say a couple of times, and my colleagues will say with me, what we're finding is that the more we can get K-12 educators to understand that it's beyond teachers, that it's those other adults in the building, whether they're social workers, counselors, nurses, health professionals, but also the support staff, the bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, and whether they're doing good or harm, the security guards, all the folks who are in that building. That's really in and of itself a conversation that has allowed us to have more of a way to connect to the people out of the building who play similar roles. So we see that as sort of a 1-2 piece. And then articulate this idea of a thriving youth field, similar to the early childhood field, as something that is really, it transcends just what's happening in K-12. It transcends what's happening in after school, out of school, and youth development. It really has to support all of the spaces where young people spend their time voluntarily or not voluntarily. And I don't know what do we have the slide next to show the thriving youth field, Terry? I can't remember which one is next. Yeah. So in that very basic sense of, we know there are lots of places where young people spend their time. We have been invited into K-12 conversations. That's the blue box. You've got a bunch of people on the phone with you who are extremely passionate about that gold box, that goldenrod box, whether we come at it from after school, out of school, summer, youth employment, job pathways, civic engagement, youth organizing, faith organizations, that mix of folks in that box. We really want to make sure if we're going to have equity conversations and injustice conversations, we're acknowledging that we have to recognize that the young people we're talking about are also connected into systems that are providing very basic services for them and maybe doing it in unjust ways, that when they come into our systems, we have to acknowledge that. And the same is true for child welfare, juvenile justice, and police. And yes, there's a question about whether that box should be called safety, but that's a different conversation we can have later on. So that broader frame, and Hal will talk more about that, is what we've been doing. And the last thing that I'll say is that a part of what we have started to do, and Terry's going to send these out to you next week, is learn how to really sort of dig in and be very specific together. And I will tell you, and we'll all tell you from experience, having folks who are coming from a deep research perspective, a sort of a thought leadership, aligning, moving trains perspective, and a deep equity perspective, agree on what we mean by stuff and how we communicate it, is in and of itself a project. So that's sort of our first readiness project that we stood up. Where we have landed is that we really need to give people a basic formula for how these things connect, and a way to have a conversation in which a commitment to robust equity, and we'll give you the definitions of these later, a commitment to robust equity is in the formula, not just a word on the side. So how do we really push towards making sure young people have transformative learning experiences? So we're activating their sense of agency, their sense of competency, not just, it's more than academic learning, it's more than content learning. How do we combine that with robust equity to make sure that the conditions in which they're doing that learning really are equitable and supportive? And how do we have broader definitions of what we mean by youth success that encompass all the elements of thriving? And there's a paper that we'll be doing that hopefully, if we all get it signed off on, will come out next week and be in your inboxes. What you can get to right now is a blog series that we've set up. The first one was really sort of saying what happens when out of school time is all the time. And the second one that just went up last week was really on summer period, learning period, loss period, leadership period, challenging us to use the science to make sure that the language that we're using is doing no harm. You're going to hear more examples about that later on. We're really sort of digging into this commitment to have robust definitions of the words that we throw around. But my colleagues are going to sort of give you more of a sense of the specific things we're doing in a minute. I will stop talking.
Thanks so much, Karen. Appreciate the overview there. You've talked about how we're emphasizing equity. We've been doing that since the very beginning, but of course it's more urgent than ever. So I'm going to take this screen share off and hand off to Hal. If you'll talk a little bit more about this and the collective work to upend equity in the work.
Sure. Thanks, Terry, and thanks, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. So when we talk about education, learning, and development, we're very clear that this is all spaces, all adults that engage. Wherever teaching, learning, and development takes place, that's education. And if you start from that place, it leads you naturally to talk about the kinds of things that are going to make a difference in young people's lives. The goldenrod box that Karen referenced, for us, is really about the ways in which we can engage the full spectrum of education stakeholders, not just the school building folks, not just classroom teachers, but everyone in conversation with each other. Those of you who have heard me before know that I posit it as this: when we talk about what goes on in education, we often frame it incorrectly. Schools don't have communities, communities have schools. Schools are there as an educational force to help a community do its work. And if you have that premise to begin with, you begin thinking about the ways in which all educational stakeholders have a voice in achieving not only educational goals, but also the larger equity goals. What kinds of things matter? How do we move beyond kind of polite definitions of equity, things that folks have mastered in their day-to-day practice, in their professional lives, to be very comfortable talking about aspects of equity without necessarily naming the very things that need to be upended. That vagueness gives a certain protection. It also means it limits our work unnecessarily. If we begin thinking about the more robust definitions of equity, specifically upending inequity, right? Identifying them, upending them, and then moving on to the next. An intentional process we think is necessary to build on the work that's been going on, but also that might suggest new directions and new dimensions to that direction. So our conceptualization of equity really recognizes equity across three foundational pieces. One is that it's the intentionality around countering inequity, institutionalized privilege and prejudice, contextual deficits, what kinds of assets are in a community, what kinds of assets do individuals and individual young people bring to bear on their education and development. Secondly, it's multidimensional. So it's overall thriving. It's not just one dimension. It's not just the things we might measure via accountability under ESSA, or the kinds of things that might be contractual obligations where we say we're going to deliver X amount of bodies to go through Y amount of hours. But it's more about the ways in which these systems might work together. And so lastly, it's cumulative, rooted in historic awareness, a commitment to long-term complex change, and perhaps thinking about different ways to measure equity. Again, beyond the kinds of bean counting I think we're accustomed to, it's really about the interplay between policy, research, practice, engagement. That's the way we're going to be able to define equity more robustly, and importantly, begin to think about the ways that we can work differently to achieve it. Lastly, I'll say, the National Urban League over the past year has engaged in a number of listening sessions that I think have helped inform the ways in which we talk about what's possible, but also what the science says. So our intention was to do kind of less formal focus groups and really talk to different stakeholders in the education realm. So we spoke to out-of-school time providers. We spoke to social workers. We talked to parents and young people themselves. We talked to researchers. We wanted to get a better sense of how the science was landing, how these frames were landed. The Seed Commission report, the Sold Alliance reports, the kinds of things we were seeing from Castle, from everywhere where we could find narratives and graphics that spoke not only to equity, but to a more broad sense of thriving, a better sense of what young people need to be able to do to be successful, the kinds of things that adults need to invest in order to drive that success. And what we found was there was a profound disconnect because one, people didn't understand the language, right? And so there was a sense that we need to do more translation. I think the Readiness Projects is certainly about that, backed by the partners in the Alliance. I think secondarily, we saw that there was a real fear amongst people that you would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of frames, and that if we didn't start talking about the central thing, right, the idea that young people should be thriving, young people should be successful, having gone through whatever educational processes and developmental processes we set up, that we could get lost in the jargon, we could get lost in the graphics, and we really needed clarity around the kinds of things we thought mattered most. Not mattered, but mattered most. And I think that's the stickier narrative work that Karen mentioned. Lastly, we really began to see that there was a lot of work that was already going on in the community, in out-of-school time programs, in summer youth employment programs, in library programs, and yes, in that building we call school, and that we didn't need to start with an idea that everything needs to be thrown out and we have to begin again. Instead, we said this is about helping people develop a more common language to talk about the great work that's already going on, a way to bring some coherence, if not strict alignment, but coherence around the kinds of things that we're doing, the meaning that we're making, the equity that we're addressing in a process way, and the kinds of things we wanted to focus on because we know that they work, right? They're there, the practice is ongoing, in some cases for decades, perhaps now backed by science, and the language that we develop together will end up in a fundamentally different place because we've now broadened the research base, we've broadened the practice base, and created a way for us to have a policy-laden conversation informed by both.
Thank you, Hal. It's powerful stuff. I appreciate your perspective here. Deb, what do we mean by informed by science? We say it a lot, but if you could tear that apart a little bit and what sciences we're talking about would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's hard not to respond to my colleagues. This is why we like working together. I want to grab a cup of coffee and start talking to Hal about measurement. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question, and certainly science isn't new, and evidence on learning and development isn't new. And for many of you have been participating in that for the entirety of your careers. But what the Science of Learning and Development Alliance, which wasn't called that at the time, it was a well-meaning group of researchers, did several years ago, was to bring together the disparate bodies of evidence about how we learn and develop, from anthropology to education and learning sciences, the same body of knowledge where social and emotional learning and other frameworks come from. And they brought it together, so those established sciences and bodies of evidence, along with the new neuroscience, which is what everyone's really excited about, because for many of us, when we learned about cognitive development, like me in grad school, it was behavioral. It was what you could see and kind of surmise. And now we have all this cool brain mapping. And so what this great group of folks did, and AIR was included in that, not myself, but my colleague David Osher, was that they brought that body of knowledge together. And what that did, I think, was really powerful because it was unifying, right? It wasn't a framework. It wasn't trying to be, it wasn't adding to the confusion that Hal was just articulating, but it was presenting a comprehensive body of knowledge of how all young people can learn and develop. And I realize when I'm saying all, I'm being a little dismissive in the way that Hal just articulated. And what it did was it helped us understand optimal times in learning and development. We already knew about early childhood. And for any of you, like me, who as a teenager, this isn't a shock. But we also saw that adolescence was an optimal time for learning and development. But what we learned that was new in the science, not in our field of risk and resilience, for those of you who are around then, was that young people who have experienced trauma, toxic stress, and other challenges in their lives, and really all of us, not just young people, but that didn't need to be their pathway towards the future, that the brain really was resilient in a chemical way, and that through relationships and identity-safe contexts, that young people could develop and thrive despite that trauma and those experiences. And so that drove all of us. I think we were all, Karen said this earlier, we were all on our path to kind of excitedly take this information and propel us towards a more intentional implementation. We were all trying to take that information and move it into the body of work in my particular arena and out of school time to say, this is really important. We're doing a lot of this stuff, but we need to do it better in order to ensure that young people have opportunities to thrive. And so that body of science, called the science of learning and development, has now expanded from those well-meaning scientists to be a larger group of people who are much more purposefully trying to move this into policy and practice, and in exploring the measurement conundrum that Hal described. But there's also other bodies of science. I have my little visual here, The Promise of Adolescence, that came out from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Math, that really sources a lot of that same information, but is more expansive to the other parts of the ecosystem that Karen shared earlier. So that's a very brief summary of a lot of really long papers. And you know, as Karen said, with the Seed Commission, which I was honored to have been a participant in that working group around youth development, as Karen, Priscilla, and Rita led that effort, we were also really trying to ensure that this great learning from the science of learning and development wasn't solely applied in the place called school. And so I see my friend Steve Fowler on the call. I'm going to call him out. He was saying, this is so important. How do the networks grapple with this? How do the statewide after school networks grapple with this? And I said, let's work on it with them and learn from them. And we did that. And then I said, hey, Karen, what do you think about this? Is this, you know, does this align with your thinking? And so really a lot of what we were doing informally became much more formal through the Readiness Projects. But we are eager to continue along that path to be important translators and not just kind of, I always say with my evaluator hat, put the circle around the logic model and say equity, check the box, thriving at the end, but to really be intentional and map out those components that Hal was saying as we design programs, implement programs, and ultimately evaluate programs.
Thanks, Deb. I always love hearing the summary. So I know many of you are thinking, as I often am, these folks are brilliant. There's a lot of great stuff coming from it. What are you doing? You know, what is this? So Marita's going to give us a little more practical of just what it is and how you hook in. I also see a lot of really good questions coming in, so we'll pull some of those in right after Marita talks, but continue to chat in the box. Marita?
And I'll try to bring a couple of those in as we're chatting. I think in this piece, just to make it concrete, I want to be able to give you a sense of who we've been partnering with, the broader group of co-strategists that we've been working with over the past year on this, and give you a snapshot of a couple of very specific projects. One that's more in the in connecting and bridging in the K-12 space. And how are you really bringing the science into to inform and influence the work, and then others that are really illuminating the work that's happening in out of school time and community programs, and then build it to, I think, the next conversation that we're going to have, which is, and what about now? This is the work that's been happening, but what's really emerging now as people are thinking about kind of building back better in the year to come, looking at a lot of the systems and things that we already have in place. So actually, Terri, I'm going to ask you to back up just one slide, I think, to this piece, picking up on the, I think one of the questions was, how do you build a stickier narrative? What is an example of that? And what both Hal and Karen and Deb have been talking about of how do you kind of translate the science findings into things that people can use. And the piece that we have up on the screen right now is something that was developed with Turnaround for Children and with the SOLD Alliance. And there's much more depth behind this, but trying to articulate what does it mean to create an optimal experience, focusing on positive relationships, really engaging environments, the kind of supports that understand the individual and group experience, really developing those skill sets and mindsets, and really powerful experiences. What does it look to really create those things? Well, in the spirit of many of the things you've heard folks talk about, there was already some work underway that we were lightly connected to and heard about, that Linda Darling-Hammond with the Learning Policy Institute and Pam Cantor, Turnaround for Children, were leading, focusing on how do we take those principles of good practice and really think about system design and informing that work going forward. What does it take to do that? And I do apologize. I'm going to keep on talking, even though my dog has decided that there's somebody outside. So apologies on that. And hopefully you can still hear me okay. But what does it take to really bring that into practice? So there was a group that was set up to do that, which Priscilla and I and others have really been informing that group looking at K-12 environments. But at the same time, they said, and could you help us understand what this looks like across in community programs as well, and out of school time, and the range of kinds of programming in the community space that Karen laid out. What does it mean in terms of adults on the front line thinking about their practice? So one of the stickier narrative things that I think we've been emphasizing in this call is if every experience matters, then all adults, all places, all times matter. And what are the implications for that? It's just trying to crystallize some of those messages. So on this design principles work, what's great is both influencing, and I think very much some of the thinking in the K-12 conversations, as well as intentionally building that bridge and being able to bring in that conversation of all adults in all places. Because as you know, many of the folks that work in the OST programs are also in the school, in the school site and in the school day. And what does it mean to think about all of those adults? So that's the design principles work that we're working on, which is directly translational from the science. If you can pop up the next slide, Terry, which is just giving you a sense of who some of those other co-strategists are, and there are many more. I just tried to pull up a few names here, but there are more folks in many of those organizations listed, and highlight in what we're doing in the out of school time space specifically, and kind of the broader community program space. In addition to bringing that range of folks and others together, the co-strategists helping to plan convenings like the one we had last November in Pittsburgh, and the launch event that we had in April, this past April, that was more virtual. Just between those two came up with how about taking up, working on opportunity to really write together. So in the Issues in Out of School Time book series, there's a team that Tom McKeever with the University of Pittsburgh, Kim Robinson with Weichert Center on our team, are editors, but leading a team with many of those folks you see on that page involved, working on a piece that'll come out next year, exploring the ecosystem. How do you understand the people, places, possibilities of learning and development across different settings, but it's really kind of zooming in as well and illuminating what's happening in the community programs out of school time space. There's issue brief series, things that AAR is working on with 4-H and others to really illuminate the role of those programs. There's a youth work survey design group. How do we even understand who youth workers are and get more of a sense, kind of updating a survey potentially that was done more than a decade ago now. But there's a design group looking at the feasibility of a national survey. And I know I'm running through some things quickly. We can share some of this in the follow-up, but Dale Blythe and many others are leading that effort. So there are things that are really trying to understand the broader ecosystem of learning and development and how the science can be useful there, but also just illuminating and understanding more that golden box that Karen and Hal were talking to. And then I think I'm just going to bridge into the next discussion, which is what are we seeing now? And in all the conversations in these past few months and really in these past few weeks, this conversation of there's some things we have to do differently. We need to be thinking about how to build back better, not just thinking about this fall, but thinking about next summer and the year that follows. How are we really thinking about this? And so many folks are writing up those kind of plans for return and re-engagement and saying, what are some of the key messages or principles or lenses that we should be looking at that with? And so one of the things that has already started happening is a group is coalescing around how do we inform that planning, both in terms of what are things that people are trying to influence now. Many of your grantees, no doubt, are being asked to sit around tables at the state level or locally. What are some key things as they're at those tables, some key message points grounded in the science that they can bring to those conversations about the importance of that broader set of community players and that broader set of experiences? How can we really be able to connect that? So there are folks like the After School Alliance, Every Hour Counts, the 50 State Network, Aspen Institute, Castle, others that are in this conversation about how do we inform each other's plans as people are doing that, and what are some of the key messages that would really be useful as people think about really truly doing business differently. In that next conversation, I think I can speak a little bit about what's happening at the community level, but I want to pause there after running through that litany of projects and turn back over to my colleagues.
I wanted to just open, Deb or Hal or Karen, any other concrete projects that you can give as an example, just to put some real teeth on this. Deb?
Sure. Marita mentioned briefly, but I'm kind of excited about it, so I'm going to go a little deeper on the what we're calling vignettes. We've been working with the SD Bechtel Junior Foundation grantees, which I think most of you know represent most of the big national youth-serving organizations, nature-based organizations, sports and play organizations. And one of the things we realized really quickly in working with the statewide after-school networks on translating the science of learning and development is that it was important that practitioners across all settings were able to see themselves in the work. They were both able to validate what they were already doing and able to articulate how they could push themselves to better align with the science to meet the goals that my colleagues have articulated. So we're working with 8 of the organizations that are Bechtel grantees to help them tell their stories about both how their practices align with the science, but honestly how they're also grappling with it and maybe pushing back and saying, this is really hard to implement with the structures that we have. We need this and, X and such enabled to do this. And we're working alongside collaborative communications and Terri's team to both bring the evidence to fore, but also to tell the story in ways to their stakeholders that are critically important. I'll stop there. There's a lot more there and a few other papers we're collaborating on, but I think that's really exciting so that people who are working directly with young people or leading that work can start to really grapple with the science as we're grappling with some of the ideas around the science.
Great, thanks so much, Deb. Hal, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thanks, Terri. In addition to what we've outlined, I think there are at least 2 things I'd like to highlight. One, the National Urban League has an affiliate structure, so we're in 90 communities, 36 states plus DC. And one of the more concrete, pressing parts of this project is a number of our CEOs are on reopening councils and committees stood up by public health officials, by mayors, by governors. And one of the reasons they're there is because we are program providers, summer youth employment programs, out of school time programs, as I mentioned, programs for youth who are juvenile justice involved, things like that. And what we've been trying to do is to get them to infuse this kind of work in those conversations. So we're not just talking about what happens physically in distancing the desk and reopening schools on some schedule or reopening a community on some schedule, but really thinking about the impact of people as they come back into these spaces. If we're going to imagine a virtual environment in some of these situations, what kinds of things do we need to attend to make sure young people continue to thrive, to make sure the adults are actually well supported also. In that though, we know a little bit because we do health programs and health advocacy. The social determinants of health have raised serious equity issues around health, public health, that are connected to education, that are connected to workplace environments. And we really want to take advantage of this moment to continue knitting those things together and not just talking about one aspect of it, which might be the schools reopening. But a lot has been revealed over the last 3 months about the ways this society works and doesn't. And we want to make sure that that is also informing these reopening plans. The second thing I would speak to is this idea that we need to do much more work around what happens on the other end of the virtual environment. So one of my colleagues mentioned to me that we spent a lot of time talking about the kinds of preparation and professional development that young people, that teachers needed to translate their curriculum, their approach into the online environment. But we didn't spend nearly as much time talking to families and young people themselves about what it is to receive that, right? To learn in those environments. How do you protect young people's learning and development virtually? And what kinds of preparations should we be thinking about as schools reopen, as we have a jagged reopening in the fall, and those who have to attend summer school, that these issues matter. And I think that the Readiness Projects is just the kind of work that can help inform that. The science that Deb is mentioning, the passion and work that we've been engaged in over the past 3 months, yes, but in much longer terms. What do we know about how young people need to thrive in an unsettling environment, a traumatized environment? And how do we apply that to the various ways in which we imagine we'll be assisting in their teaching, learning, and development in the summer and fall? And so that's another of the work that we're thinking about. In some cases, we're further along than thinking. We're actually crafting some responses, but we look forward to learning more from folks in local communities, folks on this call and webinar, about the kinds of approaches you're taking or you're hearing of others take that might inform the larger national conversation and policy environment.
Yeah, it's so important right now. Karen, you got to tell us how you're doing this responses part, because it's really important and timely.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll build directly on what Hal said. So, you know, I don't think the irony of this will be lost, but let me talk to you about what we hope we're going to be sort of kicking off with a deep conversation in Tulsa. And obviously it's Juneteenth and we're talking about Tulsa, and there are many reasons why Tulsa is on the national screen in relation to the conversation that we're having. But Tulsa also seems to be the place where every initiative that we're involved in has gravitated towards. So Tulsa is, I'm looking at Polly on the screen, Tulsa is one of the Wallace Pacelli sites, the Partnership for Social Emotional Learning Initiative. The Turnaround for Children is working on a high school reimagine effort in Tulsa. The Pacelli work is at the elementary school. The Aspen Education and Society unit has Tulsa as one of their 12 districts that they work with in terms of really supporting superintendents in a peer learning group. Opportunity Project in Tulsa is a part of Every Hour Counts, and we really need to sort of stand up this conversation about the role of local intermediaries and state intermediaries in really supporting the partnership work that we're striving for. Tulsa is one of the Castle collaborating districts, and Tulsa is also one of the places where the partners in the Equitable Learning and Development Project all have sort of joint projects, and we could go on from there. The interesting thing is that as this work has unfolded, and because of the good work that the Opportunity Project has done with the school district, we had a call really yesterday, and the Opportunity Project is one of the intermediaries we've just been checking in with to find out, tell us how things are going. Like, no agenda, how is this work unfolding? How is COVID hit? How is the broader injustice work hit? What's happening and how can we be helpful? Because when you come to the table, the question is, am I bringing an agenda? Am I just coming to be helpful? When our out of school time intermediaries get invited to the table, their first question is, what do we do? And so what they have had an opportunity to do independently is apply for an AIM High grant and get an opportunity to really work with one of the most struggling middle schools to set up a project in which you can demonstrate the power of taking everything that we know about the science, bringing it in to really intentionally support a small group of young people to give them the full experience, but then train in a critical mass of all of the adults in the building to really understand what's happening with those young people. So it's not just, let's show that we can do this, let's show it and show it to a critical set of 30 to 40 adults who are in this middle school with the idea of scaling this work across. as we had that conversation, the question was, how does that connect to the other things that are happening in K-12? And it was really clear that in spite of all this attention, each of those initiatives that I've named don't sit in the same place, don't have connections together. So one of the things that we want to do, and this can happen in any community, and I raise this because it can happen in any community. Tulsa just happens to have somehow been the mecca for all these initiatives. But whether they're national initiatives or local, the likelihood that important things that are going on are happening in parallel tracks, even in your community, is important. So if we're going to build back better and broader, this is a real opportunity for us to bring all of those folks to the table. And the good news is we now have deep relationships with every one of those folks that I named. So we can not just bring them to the table in a webinar and say, hey, let's listen to what's going on and share stories. We actually can push that forward and say, how can we be supportive in really learning in Tulsa and in other places, how if we connect the dots between these things, really using the science to undergird, using this much more robust definition of equity, how can we build back better? So one of the things that we want to do, we would love to talk to more of you about this, is if you are in communities where you see this fragmentation happening, but you also see the opportunities, those are exactly the kind of places where we think this value add approach to say, let's call it a readiness project, which just means we're going to really work with you to figure out how you build back better, broader, with more attention to equity related to your Black and brown students. How do we do that in a way that doesn't bring in a demonstration project, but really helps you figure out how to leverage what you know? The other thing I'll share just quickly is you had the blue wheel, Rita had the blue wheel up for a minute. We have really found that a very powerful way to get people to pause and understand that each setting where young people spend their time has a different opportunity to come in one of those slices. They may lead with relationships. They may lead with social emotional skill building. They may lead with integrated services, and they're providing some of those basic services that Hal talked to. Everybody starts someplace. The message that's been so important to get out with the science is you can do harm if you don't address all of these. You don't have to take all of them up to the same level, but if you're really not monitoring and understanding that the environment that you're creating for young people has to intentionally look at all of these pieces, and then you need to lead with the ones where you're strong, and you need to collaborate with folks who complement. That's a very different message to bring in, and that's supporting this idea of an ecosystem as opposed to everybody sort of rowing their own way. So folks were saying, how are we making these ideas stickier? One of them is to turn them into discussion tools and assessment tools. And that's beginning to happen, and we can share more about that. That's happening at the local level from practice all the way up to sort of state policy.
Thanks so much, Karen. I see Andres had a pretty powerful question here about the epicenter. Is that something, Hal, you could jump in on and see how we might be helpful to Andres? Can you see it there?
Sure. Yeah, I see it now. So I think that's precisely the question. We have the opportunity now because of the kinds of things you ask in your question, right? That families are in different and dire circumstances around food insecurity, that there are serious trauma-related issues. And if we treat them as singular issues that are happening in silos, but more importantly, we never talk about the exponential impact of those, we are trapped in a conversation where we say, yes, this is what we can do. We will stock the food banks, and that will deal with food insecurity. We will talk about the ways in which mental health services are available online for people who need to chat and take a break. These are important things in and of themselves, but they don't orient the community and the larger municipal sector, and let's say here in New York, to think about the work more cohesively and completely. It means that everyone is attacking the problem only from their perspective and not knitting together a much more comprehensive approach around not just reopening, but surviving under pandemic, right? And so if you're what you're expressing and sharing in Corona is happening, I think, all across the country to different impacts and to degrees. But the ability for stakeholders to be able to organize themselves around an idea that the community has necessary assets to address this, and where it does not, we need additional assistance, whether it's investment, whether it's raw materials. All of those things are necessary. But if we continue to believe that one sector and one sector-based conversation is going to be sufficient, I think we'll end up in the exact same place, if not worse, right? Can't do no harm. We are doing harm by taking serial approaches to very complicated, intertwined issues. This moment has asked a lot of us. It perhaps needs to ask even more about working, thinking very differently, and then, of course, investing very differently, not just in solutions, but in the ground floor, the ways in which we intend to work.
Thanks, Hal. And Andres asked for a reference list. I'll take the liberty of saying I'm sure that that is something that the team would be willing to do, and Hal and team would be happy to talk with you, especially as well. We've got some takeaways and summary and only about 8 minutes left. So I'm going to pull those up, and Marita, maybe if you could frame for a second, but I'll just invite everyone to just jump in to try to cover these takeaways, and especially how the funders on the call can jump into the conversation and use you all as a resource and connect the dots.
I invite my colleagues to each, pick up an example. But I think one of the things you just heard in this last conversation is in real time, people are trying to have these conversations, and what are the tools and resources that can help those happen. And if you have communities where you're working, or grantees that you have that are working out in multiple communities, that actually helping to provide some support for them to be able to tap into these. The range of co-strategists that you saw in the piece I showed earlier are all having these conversations of how do we get practical in real time and make sure that we're being that we're aligning efforts and being supportive. So you have a range of folks that you can tap into and that we can help coordinate towards that. But if there are places or grantees that you're working with specifically to help resource them a little bit to do this work, to sit at these tables, to tap into, to help shape and tap into some of these lenses and discussion tools, that would be one very concrete way, I think, as people are thinking about how to build back better. Karen, Deb, Hal?
And just I want to acknowledge Brent's note in the chat box too, of really getting to 1 or 2 sentences. So
got it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I will try to make it 2 sentences. I think we do have a unique opportunity to really step up and bring to life this concept of an ecosystem, which is not just a laundry list of organizations that young people could go in and out of, but it actually is something that is co-created by young people experiencing. And if we could start all of our conversations with whichever grantees we have, with the conversation of how well do you understand the experiences that your young people are having, we could begin to map from the young person's perspective where they go and where they don't go, what's needed and what's missing, in a way that can compel us to work together differently. So at the forum, we basically often talk about it, this will be my takeaway, how can we use both the science that Deb talked about and the current realities that we're facing to get our leaders to think differently so that they can act differently in their own organizations so that they can act together more effectively.
Thanks, Karen. Hal or Deb?
Yep, great.
Go ahead, Deb.
So we have an agreed upon body of evidence around how people learn and develop. Who are the staff and how can we support them in implementing it? And how do we make sure that they're ready to do so? That's my 2 sentences.
Nice summary, Deb. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to answer Andres and then he has to measurement.
Sure. Hal.
So I would put it in 2 sentences. One, this moment presents an opportunity to think more broadly and more deeply. to think about the ways in which people are missing. To my philanthropic colleagues, I would say, if you are walking into these situations, if you are funding in these situations, and acknowledge that people are missing, I think it's incumbent that those become musts and not we would like to have community stakeholders from other places. That they have to be there in the same ways you would walk away if someone refused to do an evaluation. You should walk away if there's not adequate and substantial community engagement and stakeholder engagement. Secondarily, I would say we do need to think about the ways in which we measure this work and the ways in which we can say authentically that we've had some impact. The equity as a process means we have to have interim measures, long-term measures, but we need to understand the impacts we're having positively and negatively. And I would go back to do no harm, but actively try to do good.
And I just want to underscore something I hear from you all the time, and it's the focus on adolescents and teenagers, and it's often lost in these conversations. But this work and all of your expertise really raises that to the forefront because we know the science tells us it's important. So I want to thank you for that work. Any last thoughts? We have about 2 minutes. Words of inspiration. All right, we'll do a follow-up here with Kathleen in coordination with some key links, and then certainly follow up with you as some of these key resources come out in the coming days and weeks. So my pleasure to join you all and share all of this important work, and I'll hand back to Kathleen.
Great, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming on the call, and a special thanks to all of the speakers. There is a lot going on. And I'm really happy that we did the takeaway summary and that there's going to be more resources and more conversation. I think one of the takeaways for the funders on the call to think about just expanding or extending what Hal just said is around resources for people to be at the table, because being at the table is not free. And so in your portfolios, if you're trying to make sure that people are building these tables and sitting at them and collaborating and talking with each other, do people actually have the resources to do that? Because that's time and that's staff and that's money. So, but thanks again to everyone. The next, one of these is going to be July 17th because there's the 4th holiday coming up and some other programming that GFE has. I'm just kicking around a couple ideas right now that I will share with my kitchen cabinet, and we'll probably announce what that will be pretty shortly. And then we will get back into our bi-weekly Fridays. And so I hope all of you will continue to join us, and I hope you have some super inspiring and, pushing a little bit past our comfort zones plans for the rest of Juneteenth. And have a terrific weekend.